Hey there, what's up? I'm Anthony Tresca, and welcome to this edition of A Spooky Scraps, where we take a horror property, we find something kind of weird or obscure about it, or just something we want to talk about, and then we just do that. And so on this episode, we are going to be taking Nightmare on Elm Street 5, and we are going to be talking about children. Joining me here to talk about children in horror in both Nightmare 5 and just broadly is none other than Dr. Katherine Troyer.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm very excited to talk about children and any opportunity to, say how creepy and disturbing they are and have people only, mildly give you weird looks because you can then be, in horror. I mean, just in horror.
Right.
I think it's really fitting.
We have the fun little out. We're like, no, we're not talking about your child,
That's
Susan.
right.
We're talking about children in the genre of horror.
That's right.
If you see any links between your own child and the children we're discussing, what does that say about you?
Yeah, Susan, what does that say about you? So I think what's interesting about the Jake character is that,
From Nightmare 5.
From Nightmare 5, yes, thank you. Is that he's... you're not really sure what to do with him, right? Because our first introductions to him, he's a creepy little kid. He's sitting in this nightmare house, and he's, having these cryptic messages that he's saying. And
he shows up at the hospital, and he's just like a weird little know-it-all dude who just walks in on Alice and is like, I know everything, and I'm gone now. I'm a magical child.
And there's a trope within the bigger, construct of children in horror that is children in hospitals in horror, right? Buffy the Vampire Slayer has an episode as well where a creepy little kid is like, he's coming, and I think it's interesting that we see him in the hospital, right? As well as the nightmare home. Of course, by the end, right, Alice has decided that he's worth saving. He's her baby. And, then there's this sort of fight for his soul, where it's, listen to your mother and grandmother, right? This Madonna figure. And then he saves the day in a sort of vaguely Christ-like way, which we've seen as something the franchise does. But I thought it'd just be kind of interesting, why do you think it is that the horror genre is so keen, or maybe the specifically Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, but is so keen on giving us these sort of creepy little kids?
I mean, I guess isn't that what everyone is afraid of, is that the next generation is going to come along and ruin everything? And children are that next generation. They're always the bringers of new ideas, the ones who challenge the status quo, the ones who don't accept previous behavior that was deemed socially okay. Children force us to challenge our old ideas and our ways of being, because that is not their way of being. They are a new creature coming into this world for the first time, and so they are not yet broken to the ways of the world, which means that they have, I think, perhaps more fight in them than those who have been broken down already.
I think that's an amazing reading, and I think that that's the more interesting reading, but I would argue that that's a very disaffirmative view, right? Because it's saying,
you know who I am.
I know.
You know me.
But what I like is you're saying that what makes children fascinating is that they're willing to break the status quo. They're willing to do whatever. But we've talked a lot about the fact that horror is often a very affirmative genre, right? That it's oftentimes very much interested in saying that children aren't going to disrupt the system because the system needs to be disrupted. It's children need to be saved because they're precious and tiny so that they can continue on our legacy, right? So it's interesting because when we have these evil children that are breaking the status quo, right? They're evil, right? They're not the heroes most of the time. They're the ones that have to be punished for it, or they're the ones that are going to do the punishing. And I think so I really like your answer, but I feel like it doesn't match what a lot of horror's trying to do, which is to make children these precious things. And so what could be more horrifying
than it happening to them?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a fairly good reading, I think, too. Yeah.
And there's a book on this by Dominic Leonard called Bad Seeds and Holy Terrors, the Child Villains of Horror Film, and he kind of breaks it down. And he has some interesting classifications. He talks about films like The Orphan, The Orphan, and the fact that in that film, there's this weird, like, element where she's kind of sexualized, but she's not, right? And so that there's this, like, uncanniness to children, right? And I think it's worth bringing into this sort of equation that, like, children as a concept, childhood as a concept, right, is a fabricated cultural construct.
That's right.
And it's not even that old of one. So if we go back to right before the Victorian era, so like the late 1700s, like, children as young as 4 were expected to not just, like, do stuff in the home, but work. Right?
Yes.
4-year-olds were often chimney sweeps because you wanted really tiny little things to be up in the chimneys. And it wasn't until, the 1780s and then up through, like, the 1860s that we have a series of reform laws in England that are like, you know what? Let's make a law that says that no one can work more than 10 hours every day. Right? And we're not talking like 10 hours for people that are 30. We're talking about 10 hours for people that are 10 and under. There was a law that was like, maybe we should make it so that no one under 15 can operate heavy machinery. Right? And so
Seems fair.
Yeah,
Seems
doesn't
fair
it
enough.
though? And then like teenagehood, right, is something that scholars have talked about really didn't come around to like the 1950s. And so these are cultural constructs. And so I feel like a lot of times the horror genre is, again, in a very sort of affirmative move saying, isn't this a precious state that we've crafted? Right? Like, isn't this something that we should regard as sacred and precious? And anything that deviates from that, such as children that seem to be a little too sophisticated, or that, like, talk like adults, or have too much knowledge like Jacob does, that's what's scary, is anything that doesn't fit within this nice little culturally crafted box that we've made.
I think if that's what's scary to you about children, audience members, if you're relating to that, maybe don't have them, because you're right. I think that might be what a role that children often fall into, particularly in older films. I think as horror gets more disaffirmative and more on, like, related to grief and trauma, like of the Ari Asters in the world.
Oh, yeah.
I don't think children play the same role
No.
in like even like a Jordan Peele film. Like a Jordan Peele, Ari Aster film, children play vastly different roles than they do in, like, The Exorcist or
which is
Nightmare
so exciting.
5.
It's so exciting to see this new way that they can be crafted. For
sure, because I think children, as we're now coming to understand them, are more there. I think we're far more afraid of that there might not be a next couple generations now than we were a little whiles ago. Even in the 89 when Nightmare 5 came out, I don't think that people were nearly as worried that there might not be a next generation or a next couple generations as we are today. And so I think that's reflected in the children and how children are treated in horror films, because now it's much more like, they're all we've got. So, like, they'd better know something. They'd better be able to protect us. They'd better have some agency. And
instead of it being, these kids want to break the system, therefore the kids must be evil, we're getting a little bit more of, these kids want to break the system. Maybe something's wrong with the system. And that's really exactly interesting. Right. I think you're right that we're seeing fewer sort of evil child villains than we did in the 70s, 80s, and 90s.
And when we do, because I also don't want to say that we don't see just evil children anymore, because I mean,
we do.
for every like disaffirmative, more highbrow horror, you also still have, like, regular affirmative stuff that is just kind of like, yeah, children are still a little spooky, aren't they?
Yeah.
And so it's more than a dichotomy, because there's a much more broader spectrum. That childhood and what's scary about children and why we keep putting them in horror films than just like, it's because of this or this, but
But
it's certainly interesting.
It is interesting that in a genre that is typically coded as not being for children, despite the fact a lot of people are like, but that was what I grew up on, right? But despite the fact it's technically not coded for children, that children are such a vibrant part of the horror narrative. So if you're watching this or listening to this, what is your favorite child in horror? Is it someone that's a villain? Is it someone that's, someone to be saved? Is it someone that doesn't quite fit either into that dichotomy? Let us know.
Let us know right down below or on our social medias, which are also linked in the video description of this episode. If you haven't yet listened to our episode on Nightmare 5, I would suggest going back and listening to that, as well as any of our previous episodes, which you can find on iTunes, Spotify, or on our Podbean, where you can find our entire database of all of our episodes.
Huzzah!
So, thank you so much for joining us today. It has been a lovely little conversation over children and their horrors.
And in the meantime, we hope that you have a spooktacular day.